Hello everyone, welcome back. We're now in the second talk of the MedX, the War on COVID Perspectives from Multidisciplinary Battlefields. I'm your host, David. If you have any questions during the talk, we have a Q&A session at the end. You could click on the raise your hand button at the top of the window or ask questions in the chat. Please welcome our second speaker, Ms. Heather Fraser, the Global Lead of Life Science and Healthcare at IBM. With no further ado, I'll hand the stage to Ms. Fraser.
Thank you, David. Great. All right. Okay, well, thank you, David. Thank you, Tom, and thank you for inviting me to speak at your event today. I also want to thank my friend, colleague, and mentee, Carmen Chung, who made the introduction a while ago for us. And yeah, such a shame we were not able to meet in person, but I trust everyone's keeping safe and well in these still very uncertain times. I'm very excited and I guess humbled that I was approached to share my experiences with you. I haven't been on the front line or at the heart of the vaccine development during the pandemic, but myself and my other colleagues at IBM have been incredibly busy as the world of technology has, certainly had an important part to play over the last 10 to 11 months. And I'm also excited to virtually be back at Warwick University, as this is where I graduated with my MBA many years ago. And in fact, this morning dropped into my inbox my January alumni newsletter. So I'm reading that at the moment. So over the next 30 minutes or so, I'd like you to take you through a journey as a healthcare professional in the world of technology, really talk about what my experiences have been over the last year as the pandemic has turned our world upside down. I'm hearing feedback on myself. I don't know, can anybody else hear that? Well, it seems to have gone now, so let me carry on and see where we get to. So I was asked to start with kind of giving you a bit of a background with how I got to where I am in technology today. I should say that my role at IBM is in a group called the IBM Institute for Business Value, and I head up healthcare and life sciences within that team. So I guess I started, if I think back to my childhood, I always wanted to be a pharmacist. A lot of pharmacists say they had wanted to be a doctor and they hadn't got the grades, but I've always wanted to be a pharmacist. I used to look in the windows of our local pharmacy and see those coloured carboys and were absolutely fascinated. And, going into the pharmacy, seeing the kindly old man in his white coat, picking up and mixing the drugs and talking to the people, talking to the patients. And there was a smell about the pharmacy as well. And in hindsight, that was probably more, I guess, lavender soap than medicine, but there was still this smell that I loved. And so I set about trying to do biology and struggling at chemistry until I got my place on the pharmacy course at a college, university called UIST, which was the University of Wales Institute for Science and Technology, and it's now called it's now part of the University of Cardiff. And one aside, on my very first day of entering those hallowed halls, I met my husband-to-be, who was taking maritime studies, and he's making my supper out the back as we speak. And I guess that when I graduated, at that time, most pharmacists did go into retail pharmacy. A few of us went into hospital, but most went into retail pharmacy. And having worked for Boots during my holidays, it was I guess a natural progression to move onto their graduate scheme. And I worked across southeast of England and London, and eventually as store manager in Watford. And so, in the duration, I guess about 4 or 5 years after getting my degree, I had this itch which I couldn't quite scratch, and it was kind of, what else can I do with my pharmacy qualifications? And so I looked and I thought, well, I had spoken to somebody about industry, and I saw a job come up at Pharmaceuticals in the area of clinical trials. And so I entered the exciting world of industrial pharmacy, which took me on a 9-year journey with the company. And that gave me experience in both clinical and pharmaceutical development, and also across production, as my team actually sat within tech ops. It also gave me the opportunity to travel the world. We had sites in Switzerland, the US and Japan. And I was actually sponsored to do my distance learning MBA at the University of Warwick at that time. And I was able also to do some of that course on the full-time course and some on the executive programme. So that was a really formative part of my career. And in 1996, the merger took place between Ciba and Sandoz, and I guess that was the catalyst for me to say, well, what next? And at that time I was approached by a headhunter who was looking for consultants who had worked in clinical development and also in supply chain, so bingo. So that took me into a company called Coopers & Lybrand, which merged with PricewaterhouseCoopers to become PricewaterhouseCoopers Consulting. And it was a very exciting time, and really stretched me as a person. It was terribly tiring. I was continually on planes. And I worked in the US, Japan, Croatia, just after the war, Switzerland and India. And I was also lucky, my husband's job took us to Canada at that time, and I was able to transfer with that job and just kind of carried on with the clients that I'd been working with out of the UK. So in 2002, the company was acquired by IBM, and I guess for a long time I had like an imposter syndrome. I felt as though I knew nothing about technology, and so why would IBM want little old me? And so a mentor at the time described it to me as like having, they had hundreds of thousands of techies at the time. And they didn't need another techie, but what they needed were people that were able to translate what we knew about our industries, so that the technologists could help to make a change for good in our industries. So after that, I kind of settled down, and I felt okay, I knew my role. And in the group, the IBM Institute for Business Value, it allowed me to do this perfectly. So it's really about providing strategic insights into industry, and into industries that I've grown up and loved with a passion, and marrying that with the science of technology. Next slide, please. So if we move on to COVID now, and I was thinking about when I first came across this dreadful pandemic, apart from on the news programme, and it must have been last February, and we were going across to Menorca, where my mother-in-law lives, for her 90th birthday. And I remember going through Gatwick Airport, and there were a few people with masks on and a few people with gloves on. And then when we got to Mahan airports, there all of the passport control and the customs people all had masks and gloves on. And probably didn't think too much about it, but then on the return journey, there was much more of a heightened awareness, I think, and there was a passenger sat at the front of the plane who was persistently coughing behind her mask. And now thinking about it, I was very pleased I was sat nearer the back of the plane. But any concerns we had for the virus at the time were very soon overtaken because we came to land headlong into Storm Dennis, which was probably the worst landing I've ever had in my life. So by March, I was at a meeting down in IBM's headquarters in South Bank in London, and this was very quickly followed by the cancellation of the biggest healthcare tech conference, which is held in Florida, was going to be held in Florida the next week. And there was a lot of discussion about it being cancelled, and somebody said, well, don't worry, Donald Trump has offered to attend at the last moment as a keynote speaker, and that will still keep the hundreds of thousands of people who attend HIMSS. They will come to the conference, but you know, over the next 48 hours, it became very evident that the conference was going to be cancelled if it couldn't be moved onto a virtual platform. And IBM helped very quickly to do just that, move it onto a virtual platform in a matter of days. And so it continued in a very different sort of format. So I guess personally at that time, I also reflected on whether or not I should go back onto the front line and help my fellow pharmacists. And I've reflected on that many times over the last months. And I resolved, I guess, this in my own mind by thinking that this is the time to show that technology and healthcare can really work hand in hand. And if I do nothing else, you know, let me help my fellow healthcare professionals to understand how technology can help them. So at work, we set about understanding what people's perception was of the pandemic from multiple angles in various countries around the world. And so from a healthcare perspective, from day one, I was crazily busy. And we've conducted a survey through SurveyMonkey about travel, education, the situation with workplace, whether people were wanting to go in to see their doctors physically, or whether they would take up telehealth, and people's views on contact tracing. In the UK, 60% said that they were willing to share health and personal data, and this compared with just 50% in the US, and probably not surprisingly 91% in China, who said they'd be willing to share that data to allow for contact tracing. But trust still remained a big issue. Next slide, please, Tom. So in the survey that we undertook, one of the things we looked at was three different angles of what we've come to call our trilemma. So between March and August, we probably interviewed 14,500 people around the globe, and in August we interviewed about 1,000 people from the UK. And we were looking at how they were trying to how they would prioritise health and human life compared with the impact of the pandemic on the economy and also their own personal liberty. And from what I'm showing on the slide there is the global perspective. So what you'll see there is about a fifth chose the economy and personal liberty. And so that was making contact tracing a bit of a hard sell. From a UK perspective, it was slightly different. We saw it slanted very much at the top of the slide towards health, and to the right of the slide towards a strong economy. So we were much less worried about our personal liberties and the sharing of data. And the other interesting point of view that we came up with was we work with Edelman, and they do a regular barometer on trust, and government leaders, as we probably wouldn't be too surprised about, were the real laggards. We found government leaders. People having trust in government leaders was about 42%, where scientists were right at the top of the table, with about 80% saying that they really trust the scientists. And interestingly, there was much more focused on people's local communities. So 69% said that they trusted their own communities over kind of citizens throughout the whole society in their countries. So just you know, an interesting slant on what we're seeing across countries. And you know, we hear, don't we, when we listen to our politicians, there's always this concern about, you know, what Boris Johnson is saying from, you know, the economy perspective versus the, you know, what we're doing with our vaccines and our liberty, our personal liberty. And so that's, you know, what we call in this slide the trilemma. Next slide, please, Tom. One of the other things we looked at was how people are using technologies, and which technologies had the largest impact during the pandemic. And what we looked at this. We call this what we saw was that what we're calling digital transformation. So that's using technologies to reinvent and improve businesses. 60% of respondents to a survey that we did said they were using the pandemic as a time to really accelerate the digital transformation. And our research showed that mobile, artificial intelligence and supporting cloud technologies were what were providing the greatest performance impact across the industries. And I'll show you a bit more about how they were doing that as we go to the next slide. So although artificial intelligence, AI, has a relatively low level of adoption across industries, or in this particular survey, it probably presents the greatest opportunity to deliver the highest performance impact. And we particularly see that in life sciences. And what we're seeing is that each industry has a unique fingerprint of technologies. So we look at them from a perspective of what's differentiating that industry, what's giving them the most opportunities moving forward, what are the essential technologies for that particular industry, and what are emerging. So if we look at healthcare and life sciences, the differentiator for them is in fact cloud. As far as opportunities are concerned, both are seeing AI as an opportunity. Healthcare is looking at remote technology and also analytics, whereas life science is looking at AI and wearables, as well as the Internet of Things. And if we look at emerging technology, healthcare is really working on mobiles and wearables. So, you know, my Fitbit or my Withings and my mobile phone for my running. And then if we think about life sciences, again, looking at analytics, how to use all this data that's being collected, mobile, and interestingly, 3D printing is coming to the forefront as well. Next slide, please, Tom. So I want to give you some examples of what IBM have been doing over the last 10 months or so during the pandemic. And I'm going to start with something that probably seems quite basic. It's using mobile technology, but it's also using virtual assistants and AI, and that's NHS 111. So this is chatbot technology for engaging with citizens. And if you think about NHS 111, it allows citizens, individuals to be assessed. Do they need to be seen very quickly? Do they need an ambulance to come out to them very quickly? But if they don't, you know, there's somebody on the end to help reassure them about what they need to do and to get them to the right health provider if needs be. So what IBM looked at doing at a very early stage was working on implementing virtual assistants in a number of healthcare services around Europe. So it was about using natural language process capabilities, so understanding what you and I would say when we phone up NHS 111, I should say, and really trying to get to understand and respond to the common COVID-19 related questions. And why was this important? Well, you probably saw on the news at the beginning that there were huge queues, you know, people waiting for hours on NHS 111. So after a while, you saw this chatbot would appear, and that was what we were doing. And this was about, you know, putting your mind at rest. But if you did have the COVID symptoms that needed dealing with immediately or very quickly, then being taken to the front of the queue virtually. And I'm showing there Kerry or Sari, and this is we worked with the health NHS in Wales to make sure that we were able to provide the chatbot technology both in English but also in Welsh as well. And then kind of building on that, we built a virtual agent with the Royal Marsden Hospital, and this was for key workers, and this was to give them immediate access to COVID-related information related to HR policies within the hospital. So really as kind of the workplace, guidance in the workplace was evolving across country as we went into the lockdown. How could the hospitals continue to work efficiently to inform their workforce and to alleviate the worries of the key workers that they were, you know, obviously experiencing at a very challenging time when they were having to deal with patients, but they were also worried about their own health as well. We then went on to work with the NHS on their digi-trials and particularly on the recovery clinical trial, which is the biggest clinical trial that's been being run in the UK, or randomised COVID-19 clinical trial in the UK and in fact in the world now. And it aims to identify treatments that might be beneficial for adults hospitalised once they're confirmed with COVID-19. So there were 12,000 patients in the trial across 176 sites, and it was over a 3-month period. And so what IBM helped to do was to repurpose the infrastructure so the clinical trial could be rolled out safely and the data could be collected quickly from the patients in a much more quickly. So we were looking at things like dexamethasone, which is a very common steroid, and we were trying to move clinical trials from having 20 pages in their protocol to taking that down to something that was much crisper, that could be done on an iPad, could have just a 2-page consent form. The regulatory approval was taken down from 30 to 60 days, just down to 9 days. And the data was collected quickly, and more importantly, the results were made public very, very quickly as well. Digital health pass. This is something that we've partnered with an organisation called Salesforce. And if you think about this, this is your digital wallet that you put in your pocket. And it uses a technology called blockchain, which helps organisations to try and safely reopen either their work facilities. They may be looking to reopen a hotel. It could be in the future to open cruise ships, for example, but opening the travel industry again. And so, but it also maintains the individual's privacy. So it's a way of sharing your vaccination and your health status with those that need to know and that you want to share it with, but keeping it private from everyone else. So using, as I say, the technology of blockchain, which you might have heard about used in banks, for example. And we're also looking to use blockchain in the vaccine supply chain. So governments around the world are grappling on planning who's going to get the vaccination. You only need to turn on the news or the briefings, and you will have heard, who's going to be next in the queue. Should we move the queues around? Should the key workers and the doctor and the teachers get it before the over 70s, for example? So, and then also the other thing there I would say is also, really tracking when people need to get their second dose. That's the other thing that we need to think about. So this is all about how can we jumpstart that economy so there's that safe return to work and safe return to education. And, we're confronted with the vaccines of the cold chain storage. We want to make sure that there's fair supplies going out across the country and across the borders, and we want to maintain trust. And as you probably heard on the news just before Christmas, we don't want the cyber security to be an issue either. So a blockchain again has come in to provide an open source vaccine management system. And I always like the analogy here, you know, if you think about in the past when we tried to get a taxi, you know, we either had to stand in the street and hail a taxi, or phone the local taxi service, and you know, we didn't know when it was going to turn up. We had to, you know, look out of the window, stand in the rain or whatever. And now with the advent of Uber, you know, you can track when the taxi is turning up. And again, this is just like, you know, the vaccine supply chain. You can track where it is in the supply chain. So you know when it's going, who's going to deliver it, when it's going to be with you, and how much is going to be there. And then we have a few examples of other examples where we're helping doctors. This one is in Australia, in fact, and it was started in Australia, but it's being used around the world. It's called the COVID Critical Cares Consortium, and it's really looking at, you know, the power of sharing silos of information that's being built as people get to understand and learn about their patients, and really get, you know, building that bigger picture and better understanding of what this pandemic and what this disease looks like. So, and we've been using design thinking and agile methodologies to produce a dashboard, so people can, or doctors can look at it very quickly on an iPad whilst they're in with their patients. So we're looking at what we call glanceable consumability. We're looking at simplicity being key. People need to be able to trust the data. Doctors need to, and key workers need to be able to trust themselves, but also trust others, and put it in the context of the workplace that they're working in. Next slide, please. Quickly going over this slide, you know, you all have heard, I'm sure, about the different waves in COVID. This was a blog we put together back in May, where we talked about, yes, there was likely to be, you know, COVID was moving the chronic conditions out, and so there was going to be a second wave, which was going to be the delayed treatment, as well as post-COVID ICU rehabilitation. And I think, you know, if we think about the long tail of COVID, I think is the better way of talking about it. The third wave being those people who should have been having treatment, such as their oncology treatment, but that's been delayed and their conditions maybe have got worse. But then we see this large tail of people who have been having issues as far as mental health burnout and domestic abuse, for example. So really thinking here about, you know, how do we address that first wave? We've seen people, you know, reconfiguring their existing capacity, the Excel centres, the field hospitals, and step-down facilities in hotels, and really thinking about, you know, how we flatten all of those curves out. Next slide, please. And so the other thing, I mentioned the mental health, the other thing that we've been doing is doing some research which covers both the body and the mind. We actually started the research here on mental health before the pandemic, but as we realised what was happening in the lockdown, you know, we quickly looked at, you know, the perspective of the pandemic and the toll it was taking on people's mental health. And, you know, we listened, 53% globally said it was taking a toll on their mental health. If we look at the UK and the US, it was about 49%. India was as high as 68%. 68% in fact, and a lot of the issues there being the poverty and people living very, very close together. But I think as an organisation, IBM again recognised very early on that lockdown was having a strain on the employees and their families. Having to homeschool, for example, and they've taken this really seriously. And we have a range of flexible working patterns. We have platforms and webinars to provide one-on-one support. It's just become a norm. The paper you see on the right-hand side, just after the first lockdown happened, I was contacted by our corporate marketing department and asked for an update of this paper that we originally brought out in 2017 on loneliness and the older population. We suddenly realized it wasn't just going to be the older population that was going to have an issue here. And actually, a lot of the solutions we put in place were about people meeting face to face. And that, again, wasn't going to happen. So I quickly jumped on the phone with an old friend and colleague of mine, Nick Palmerini, who now heads up the National Innovation Centre for Ageing in Newcastle. And over a weekend, we updated this study. And interestingly, I came off a call just before this one with the Captain Tom Foundation that, I hope most of you have come across. The Captain Tom at the age of 100, who walked all those miles and has got a fantastic following now, and they've picked up on our loneliness paper and want to do something with us. But just to finish on that story, as a result of that refresh, I found myself on radio and in the press talking about the lockdown, and I was talking alongside a professor from Germany, and she was talking about astronauts up at in the International Space Station and the impact that has on their mentality, and how loneliness and what they, the impact they have and how they're using technology. So, we were comparing the impact of the pandemic on loneliness and the impact of astronauts. And I always, say, who would have thought? Who would have thought? So, coming to the end, I was kind of asked about, working through the crisis and how I felt about that. So as we went into lockdown 1, I think we all remember the good spring weather that we had. And I remember all my neighbours and friends who all seemed to be having a great holiday and enjoying themselves with new hobbies. And they were on Zoom calls. And I have to admit, I did feel a bit jealous at that stage, because I was working, long hours and at times 6 or 7 days a week, and everyone wanted a piece of me. And as I, mentioned, corporate marketing, and I guess I struggled a bit at the beginning. Yes, I was happy to do it, but I didn't seem to be able to get that balance. And things seem to be changing really, really quickly around the world. The data, one day it was in date, and within hours, I talked to my colleagues in the States as they came in to the office, and we'd find the data that we'd looked at the night before was out of date. So keeping up to date was a real struggle in its own right. And don't get me going on Zoom or team meetings or WebEx technology. And I have to admit, what with the mix of trying to do Zoom calls with the family and, other meetings I was doing in my community, moving on to Zoom, I just felt frazzled. But then I also felt guilty. And this thing about, should I go back on the front line as a pharmacist, kept coming back. And my other feeling of guilt was many of those people who appeared to be enjoying themselves were actually worried. They were furloughed and may not actually have a job to go back to. So gradually, as we went through the lockdown, I think I got my life, my work-life balance back to a sense of normality. I love my allotments and I love growing fruit and vegetables and seeing those appear throughout the spring and summer. So that was my wind down hobby, if you will. I took up Pilates online and I now do classes twice a week. It's something that I tried to do before in, not virtually, but I would have had to travel probably a couple of hours twice a week to get to classes. I joined a running group, and this is something, as a kid, I did everything I possibly could to get out of running. So, who would have thought? My community, my little community up here in the Yorkshire Dales my church keep me sane and that sense of normality. And as I say, up here in the Yorkshire Dales, looking out of my windows at the hills and knowing that largely my friends and families have been affected by the virus, I have a lot to be thankful for. So I leave you with the hope that we can all learn from the experience of the past 10, 11 months. I know particularly for yourselves and how it's affected your education is not easy. But I hope that, we can all, learn from the experience as we move into 2001 and hopefully later in 2001 when we've all got the vaccine and you can continue in the career that you set out to work in and is so important, as you will have hopefully have experienced through the pandemic. So at that, I will pass back to David and welcome any questions.
Hello. Thank you very much for such an amazing talk, Ms. Fraser. Thank you. And thank you for the insights of your experiences with COVID from your perspective. I would like to ask the first question. From your presentation, from your talk, we can see that you mentioned that during this time of COVID, it has been there has been a boosting development on both healthcare and technology. Would you reckon that would be a backfire when the pandemic is past and there is less demand for such technology and healthcare system? Is that a potential challenge to these companies that has developed this these services or systems or technologies?
Yeah, very good point. I would hope not. What I've learned out of this is that a lot of the technology. So if I think about clinical trials, for example, and the time that it typically took us to do clinical trials when I was working in industry was 10, 12 years. When I went into consulting, we were trying to get that down to 6 years, and it's still not being achieved. And then we go into the pandemic and we can get vaccines out in this incredible time, and it's only through people collaborating, it's only through people being able to connect the dots with the technology. It's from people getting together to say, let's not look at what we can't do and why we can't do this from a regulatory perspective, but let's look at what we can do. And so my hope, and I will do everything I can do from my perspective to make sure it happens, is that we learn and that we learn. I was going to use the term shortcuts. They're not shortcuts. We're still doing these things with the rigor those vaccines have still had to go through the regulatory bodies. The UK have got one of the best regulatory bodies in the whole of the world. So the fact that we got the vaccine here in the UK before the rest of Europe, that just says, wow, let's celebrate what we've got. So my hope, I guess, David, is that, the technologists go out there and shout about, the technologists and the healthcare professionals go out there and shout about the processes and what they've been able to achieve, and that we make that the norm.
Thank you, Ms. Fraser. Tom, I think you've got a question, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
I do indeed. Thank you so much for that talk. It was absolutely fascinating, and I absolutely love the work. And I think in terms of like the NHS 111, that couldn't have come at a better time, and we're seeing so many developments, and I am aware of so many people who are using that and struggling. So I think I'm just incredibly impressed at the amount of work that's happening. One of the things that's in my mind, especially over the last month or so, is the change in public perception around COVID. And when you're talking about the trilemma of the balancing between the infection rates, the economy, and your privacy and personal liberties, as you mentioned, there's a lot of dynamics that are now changing. I didn't know if there were any, if there was any work undergoing at the moment with yourselves, looking at how those data might have changed over the time course of the pandemic, because I'm aware that scientists are now potentially less trusted in comparison to what they were originally. Government maybe still have a downfall, but I'm not necessarily sure on the statistics or the actual data per se. I don't know if you had any insight into how that might have changed.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Tom. One of the so each year in our group, we are tasked with doing one big study, and my study last year was due to be about trust, and it was the trust across healthcare professionals, and you're taking it from both perspectives. What the consumer and the individual thinks about the healthcare professional, what they need to do differently, and again thinking about it from a technology perspective as well. I didn't get round to doing that study because all of these other things were happening, and I also got some pushback from our management saying, well, it's probably not a good time to be talking about trust and researching trust at this moment. But this first few weeks of 2021, the number of times I've heard that word trust, and the more people I've spoken to over the last couple of weeks, I'm thinking, and I'm actually speaking to my boss tomorrow about the topic that I do, and I am going out and I am going to do that study on trust. So although I haven't got the percentages for you now, as we move forward, I'm going to take that larger perspective as well. As I say, I was at that time I was just thinking about the consumers, the patients, and the healthcare professionals, and I want to take that wider to think about all of the collaborators, let me use the word ecosystem, everyone within the healthcare ecosystem, and the trust dynamics across that ecosystem. So I would love to come back and talk to you, Tom, and others in a few months' time, and to start to share some of our initial findings of what I am hearing from the healthcare ecosystem now.
Thank you. That's absolutely fascinating, and I'd love to hear more.
One of the things I was going to say was, you have in your cohort Carmen Chung here, and I know Carmen has worked on one of the studies I talked about as well. So, as a community, I think, Carmen, the study that you were working on is now in the public domain, and I know there's things that we can talk about and things that we can't. But I think yeah, you've got somebody in your midst now that can give you first-hand experience of the technology. So use Carmen as well.
Yeah, well, we sure will do. Thank you, Ms. Fraser, for answering the last question. If I may, I've also got a question on the trilemma of COVID-19. So I'm sure you have witnessed different countries has been taking different measures, different actions to this pandemic, and specifically based from your concept of the trilemma. I'm from China. I think they have taken a very, I could say, a drastically different measure to most of the other countries, and they think they would seem to take the priority on identified cases and death rates. And so far, it has been one of the first countries that could say back to the normal life or finish with the pandemic. How would you comment on Chinese action against COVID?
That's really interesting. I was just trying to find the data. I have it here. So if you think about that trilemma, the willingness to share that health data, as I say, was 64% in the UK, 50% in the US. In China, it was 91% was willing to share that data, which may not surprise you, but I think a lot of it is down to, from what I see, is down to culture. I have to say, I haven't actually been to China myself. I have worked with a lot of my colleagues out in China, and speaking to them about it, I guess the privacy, the dilemma of the economy, the privacy, and the infection rate. I think, going into it as the kind of the first out the gate as well, the infection rates were high. So that part of the trilemma they knew was going to be, off the scale. And I guess if I think about the privacy one, again, that was going to be high for you, just, I guess, from a culture perspective, but also the way that the economy was at that time, very strong, from whether it be a manufacturing perspective or a financial perspective. So from an outsider looking in, I think probably China has kind of come out of it. I'm not saying come out of it well from a PR perspective necessarily, but from what I see, has come out of it well from a national perspective. And I don't know if, from what you're seeing from family and friends, whether you would say the same.
Yeah, I would say we've come out just fine. Yeah.
Yeah, and we probably, you could say we could have learned some things about, at the beginning about, not, for example, if you think about in the UK, and we were seeing pictures at the beginning of people coming out of China and being taken to the hospital down in the Wirral, and being put in the COVID hospital right at the beginning, and now 10 months on, we're having that discussion in the government about, travellers from abroad being put into COVID hotels for 10 days or whatever. So, you know, for me, from that perspective, we've gone full circle on that discussion. We did it at the beginning, you know, and perhaps we just should have done it with a bit more rigor. You know, we should have maybe have thought about our liberty and said, yeah, actually, the UK is a really good place to have your holidays. Let's go and have your holidays here, as opposed to having to go to Spain or wherever. That's a personal view I have there.
Yeah, I do agree that UK probably could have taken a more aggressive measure to prevention, but I would definitely agree that a different country would have a lot more different problems to consider. So hence the difference.
Yes.
Thank you for the answer, and thank you very much for the talk. Our time is up, and it's been a pleasure to having you here on this talk. We'll have a little break now, and the third talk with Thomas will start at 5 o'clock sharp. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you again, Ms. Fraser. Thanks,
everybody. Have a good day. Bye now.
Thank you. You too.